He called me the gravel woman, like an insult, as if the stone dust on my hands was shameful. He fired me in a glass office overlooking the quarry that made his fortune. He thought he was discarding an outdated employee, never realizing he had just gutted the foundation of his empire. When the crushers went silent for the first time in decades, everyone finally understood. The one being fired was not the weakest person in that room. My name is Piper Davis. I am 41 years old, and until a sweltering Thursday afternoon in late summer, I thought I knew exactly the foundation I was standing on at Black Ridge Materials and Paving. I had built it, after all. The call to report up to the executive floor came without a single warning. I was standing down in the lowest level of the active pit, the rhythmic, bone-rattling roar of the primary jaw crusher shaking the very dirt beneath my steel-toed boots. The radio on my hip crackled to life, slicing through the industrial noise. They wanted me upstairs, immediately. I did not even have the time to stop by the wash station. I walked into the towering glass and steel main building still wearing my neon high-visibility vest, a fine layer of gray limestone dust coating my forearms, my fingernails, and the frayed cuffs of my work shirt. Grant Mercer's office was a sterile, climate-controlled vault that felt far more like a high-end minimalist advertising studio than the nerve center of a heavy aggregate and paving company. It was an offensive display of polished chrome, blinding white desks, and floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a sweeping panoramic view of the massive quarry below. The contrast was physically jarring, almost comical. I brought the harsh reality of the sight with me, the sharp smell of diesel exhaust, the tang of sweat, and the gritty residue of pulverized rock into a room that smelled faintly of expensive imported cologne and purified ozone. Grant sat anchored behind his massive, spotless desk, looking like a man playing a role he had learned from a magazine. Flanking him were two people I instantly recognized as the executioners of the corporate world. On his left was Sarah from Human Resources, her eyes firmly fixed on her notepad, desperately avoiding any eye contact with me. On his right sat a sharp-suited man with a perfectly tailored jacket whom I had never seen before. He was, undoubtedly, the new high-priced restructuring consultant the breakroom rumors had been nervously whispering about for the past 3 weeks. Grant did not offer me a seat. He leaned back in his ergonomic leather chair, steepled his manicured fingers together, and looked at me with a sickening mixture of faux pity and profound arrogance. He did not see a loyal manager who had spent over 2 decades keeping his family's crushers running through recessions, equipment failures, and brutal winters. He only saw a stain on his brand-new corporate aesthetic. "Piper, we are making some strategic realignments," Grant began, his voice smooth, rehearsed, and utterly devoid of genuine emotion. "Black Ridge is moving into a new era. The market demands it. We need data-driven thinking. We need deep analytics, predictive modeling, and corporate synergy. What we do not need anymore are quarry instincts." I stood there in the center of the pristine room, feeling the abrasive grit on my skin, and let him talk. "The industry has evolved beyond the old ways," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward the silent consultant, seeking validation. "The time of people working their way up from the dirt, making multi-million-dollar operational decisions based on the sound of a conveyor belt or the color of the dust, that time is over. We are a modern, forward-facing enterprise now. Frankly, Piper, you are just the gravel woman. You simply do not fit the new vision." He said it like a slur. The gravel woman. He intended it to be a permanent brand of inferiority, a way to reduce my lifetime of expertise to a dirty, uneducated punchline. With a theatrical sigh, he slid a thick, cream-colored manila envelope across the polished glass expanse of his desk, the severance package, the final insult. A lesser person might have screamed. Someone else might have slammed their fists onto his immaculate desk and demanded respect, listing off the years of sacrifice. But anger is a hot, messy, and uncontrollable emotion. I had learned a very long time ago that in the hard rock business, if you want to survive, you need to be as cold, dense, and unyielding as the granite you are blasting out of the earth. Instead of reacting to his pathetic insult, Instead of giving him the satisfaction of a breakdown, I kept my face entirely blank. I let my eyes drift a few inches to the right, landing on the open laptop sitting casually beside his elbow. The screen was bright. The brightness turned all the way up, displaying a highly detailed, color-coded spreadsheet. Grant was incredibly arrogant, and arrogance breeds carelessness. He thought I was utterly defeated, a slow-moving dinosaur being led to the corporate tar pits, so he had not even bothered to close his highly confidential work. In those agonizingly long few seconds of heavy silence, my eyes scanned the screen. My mind, trained to process complex logistics in an instant, absorbed the data. It was the master restructuring schedule, but far more importantly, it was the Q4 projection pipeline. I saw the list of the 6 major infrastructure contracts, 6 massive highway extensions and municipal paving jobs that Blackridge was staking its entire next fiscal year upon. I knew those jobs intimately. I knew the exact massive tonnage of aggregate required for the base layers, the specific friction coefficients demanded for the surface, the precise, unforgiving blend of crushed stone needed to meet the rigid State Department of Transportation standards. Grant thought he was standing tall. He thought he was stripping me of all my power and throwing me out into the cold wilderness. But by leaving that single screen open, he had just handed me the detailed blueprints to his own impending execution. He revealed to me, in stark, glowing green and red numbers, that his shiny new corporate vision was completely, desperately dependent on an uninterrupted, massive flow of raw materials. Materials he blindly assumed he owned free and clear. I looked away from the glowing screen and met his smug, self-satisfied gaze. I reached out and picked up the thick manila envelope. Its physical weight felt entirely insignificant, almost laughable, in my calloused hand. "I understand, Grant," I said. My voice was eerily calm, smooth, and entirely devoid of any tremor or edge. He smiled, a wide, genuine expression of relief, clearly thrilled that I was not going to make an ugly, emotional scene in front of his expensive new consultant. "I am very glad we can be professional about this transition. Piper, Human Resources will reach out to handle the formal exit interview." I turned to leave, the heavy rubber soles of my work boots thudding softly and deliberately against the outrageously expensive plush gray carpet. I walked toward the heavy glass door, my posture perfectly straight. When my hand touched the cool metal of the door handle, I paused. I let a beat of silence stretch out before I looked back over my shoulder. Grant was already turning his attention back to his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, dismissing my existence completely. "If I were you," I said, my tone low, steady, and dropping the ambient temperature in the room by at least 10 degrees, "I would read the land deeds for Parcel 9 very carefully before Monday morning." Grant stopped. He frowned, a brief, fleeting flicker of genuine confusion crossing his perfectly groomed features. His brow furrowed as his brain tried to process the specific legal term I had just dropped into his clean space. He opened his mouth, drawing in a breath to ask what exactly I meant by that, but I did not wait for his question. I pushed the heavy glass door open and walked out, letting it click shut behind me with a solid, final sound. I walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway, took the elevator down to the ground floor, and pushed through the revolving front doors. I stepped out into the brutal, sweltering heat of the employee parking lot. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, baking the black asphalt and sending waves of distortion into the air. I walked slowly toward my beat-up, dust-covered pickup truck, the familiar, comforting roar of the quarry's heavy machinery echoing in the distance. I unlocked the door, but before getting in, I paused and looked back up at the imposing facade of the executive building. High above, standing behind the darkly tinted glass of his corner office, I could clearly see Grant's silhouette. He was standing close to the window, looking down at the parking lot, looking down at me. Even from this distance, I knew exactly what his face looked like. He was smiling. He truly thought he had just finished a necessary, slightly unpleasant cleanup task, sweeping away the old dirt to make room for his clean, data-driven, highly profitable future. He had absolutely no idea that the solid ground beneath his expensive leather shoes was already gone. I was not born into a family with a trust fund, a country club membership, or a last name that easily opened heavy oak doors. My father drove a local delivery truck, and my mother worked the morning shift register at a neighborhood diner. When I walked onto the Black Ridge aggregate property for the very first time, I was exactly 19 years old, carrying a cheap plastic thermos and wearing heavy work boots I had bought secondhand at a surplus store. I did not start my career in an air-conditioned office reviewing spreadsheets. I started in the core sample laboratory. It was a stifling, windowless cinderblock bunker sitting on the edge of the property that constantly smelled of damp earth, chemical binding agents, and stale, burned coffee. My very first job was washing rocks, literally. I spent 8 to 10 hours a day standing over deep industrial steel sinks, scrubbing thick mud and clay off geological core samples so the senior engineers could analyze the structural integrity of the limestone deposits. It was tedious, backbreaking, deeply unglamorous work, but while other entry-level kids complained about the mess and quit after a month, I paid close attention. I learned to read the intricate, subtle veins running through a freshly split slab of granite. I learned exactly how different sedimentary layers fractured under immense pressure. Before long, I could look at a split-core sample and tell the lead geologist precisely how dense the deposit was and whether it would yield the high-friction aggregate needed for strict interstate highway contracts. I did not stay in that cinderblock lab forever. I possessed a desperate need to know exactly how the stone moved from the deep earth to the finished asphalt. Over the next 2 decades, I clawed my way up through the dirt, step by grueling step. I moved from the wash sinks to the quality control testing trailer, where I learned to track aggregate moisture with obsessive, scientific precision, running heavy shaking sieves all day to check the exact physical gradation of the crushed gravel. From there, I transitioned out into the elements, managing the batch plants. I learned how to run the massive mixing operations, constantly balancing the volatile ratios of sand, crushed stone, water, and cement powder. I spent grueling years up in the dispatch tower, coordinating chaotic truck schedules, learning the intricate, high-stakes dance of keeping 60 heavy haulers moving seamlessly between the active pit and the distant construction sites without causing a single traffic bottleneck or poured concrete delay. After more than 20 years of swallowing gray dust and baking in the relentless summer sun, I had become something incredibly rare in the heavy construction materials industry. I was the only person left on the entire Black Ridge payroll who actually held the complete operation in her head. I intimately understood the raw geology of the quarry, the mechanical violence of the physical mining process, the complex logistical nightmare of the transport fleet, the rigid scientific standards of material testing, and the unforgiving, penalty-heavy deadlines of commercial construction. I knew exactly how a slight delay in a dynamite blasting schedule on a Tuesday morning would directly impact a highway paving crew pouring asphalt 50 miles away on a Thursday night. I was never the kind of manager who lived inside glossy slide presentations or colorful pie charts. I managed the site by being physically present. I did not need a digital tablet to tell me if the processing plant was running efficiently. I could stand out in the main parking lot, close my eyes, and simply listen to the machinery. I knew the deep, rhythmic, booming vibration of the primary jaw crusher breaking down raw boulders. I knew the higher, erratic grinding noise of the secondary cone crushers refining the rock. If a heavy rubber conveyor belt was slipping, if a sizing screen was overloaded with wet material, or if a steel bearing was starting to run hot, I heard the subtle change in the mechanical pitch long before the warning lights ever flashed on the control room boards. I did not need an expensive digital moisture probe to tell me the material was too wet to sell. I could look at the precise shade of gray on a mountain of stockpiled aggregate and know instantly if the internal moisture content was off by even 2%. I could feel the gritty dust between my thumb and forefinger and know immediately if the fine particulate ratio was too high for a state-approved concrete mix. I was connected to the physical reality of the quarry in a fundamental way that the executives sitting in the glass tower could not even begin to comprehend. That visceral boots-on-the-ground connection was exactly why the people working in the dirt trusted me. The pit foreman, The heavy equipment operators, the tandem truck drivers, the lab technicians, and the site supervisors all knew I was genuinely one of them. In an industry notoriously famous for pushing blame downhill to protect middle management, I maintained a strict, unbreakable personal rule. I never threw a subordinate to the wolves to save my own skin at a quarterly executive review. If a batch of concrete was rejected at a commercial site because of a miscalculation at the plant, I took the direct hit from the upper management. If a tired loader operator made a stupid mistake and backed his machine into a conveyor support column, I handled the repair logistics quietly and shielded him from the immediate wrath of the Human Resources Department. I demanded absolute perfection, and I worked my crews incredibly hard, but they knew with absolute certainty that I would stand between them and the corporate firing squad every single time. We bled the same stone dust, and that shared hardship forged a fierce loyalty that corporate bonuses could never buy. My professional reputation in the valley was entirely rock solid. Over the last 5 years alone, I had received 2 separate, incredibly lucrative job offers from our 2 biggest regional competitors. Monarch Roadworks, in particular, had practically begged me to come over to their side, offering me a vice president title, a massive salary increase, and a brand new company truck. I turned them down. Both times. I stayed because I honestly believed I was building something permanent at Blackridge. I believed in the solid foundation I had helped lay alongside Elias Mercer, the original founder, back when the company actually valued the rough hands of the people who produced the physical product. That was why the specific words used to fire me stung with such a toxic, lingering venom. When I was called the gravel woman, it was not just a cheap professional insult tossed across a desk. It was a calculated, deliberate slap in the face to 2 straight decades of backbreaking blue-collar labor. It was an executive dismissing the physical sweat, the blown-out knees, the permanent ringing in the ears, and the countless late nights spent fixing broken conveyor belts in the freezing rain. It was the ultimate arrogant expression of contempt from the tailored suits directed entirely at the working class. The new leadership looked at my scuffed work boots and saw only uneducated filth, completely blind to the fact that the very dirt on my boots was the exact substance paying for their imported coffee and their minimalist office furniture. But the greatest mistake those executives made was confusing my quiet, blue-collar demeanor with ignorance. Because I never bragged about my accomplishments, because I never demanded the spotlight at the annual corporate retreats, and because I vastly preferred the honest company of diesel mechanics over marketing directors, no one at the headquarters truly understood the woman they were dealing with. They thought the woman of gravel and stone was just a stubborn, outdated fixture of the pit, a piece of old machinery that could simply be swapped out when it became inconvenient to their new vision. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent years quietly watching the corporate tide turn. They did not know that while they were busy playing office politics, attending seminars, and fighting over who got the corner office with the best view, I was silently securing my own ground. They looked at me and saw a woman they could easily discard, completely unaware that the gravel woman had meticulously built her own unshakable foundation, preparing an ironclad legal and financial exit strategy long before the new executives ever stepped foot in their shining glass tower. 7 years ago, long before Grant Mercer ever learned how to spell the word aggregate or purchased his first tailored suit, Blackridge Materials and Paving was staring directly down the barrel of total corporate annihilation. The old man, Elias Mercer, was still firmly at the helm back then. He had made a massive, catastrophic financial gamble on a regional expansion right as the commercial real estate market dramatically softened. Compounding that disastrous timing was a sudden, vicious environmental dispute over silica dust runoff near our eastern property border. The state regulatory boards clamped down hard, issuing massive fines, and the commercial banks immediately panicked. They froze our revolving credit lines overnight. The company was bleeding cash at an apocalyptic rate. I remember the suffocating, toxic tension in the air during those dark months. If the main pit stopped producing raw stone, the domino effect would be instantaneous and fatal. The asphalt and concrete batch plants would starve for material. The municipal paving contracts would immediately default. the performance bonds would be called in, and the entire Blackridge empire would simply cease to exist. Elias was an incredibly proud man, a titan of the local heavy industry who had built his vast wealth with his bare hands. But the ruthless bank executives had him backed into a corner with a knife to his throat. He was utterly desperate. While the highly paid financial advisors and the panicked board members were desperately trying to leverage the company logo, the rusted fleet of haul trucks, and the aging heavy machinery to secure emergency bridge loans, I was looking at the actual ground beneath our feet. I realized then what none of the men in the expensive suits understood. The true, irreplaceable value of the company was not the aging iron, the worn-out conveyor belts, or the brand name painted on the side of the mixer drums. The real power lay in the dirt itself. It was the exclusive, highly regulated mineral rights. It was the massive, deep-water recycled retention lake that washed our stone, without which the environmental agencies would shut us down in a single afternoon. It was the intricate network of internal haul roads that bypassed public highway weight restrictions. It was the specific, perfectly zoned parcels of land where the batch plants sat. Without those specific, immovable assets, the company was just a collection of overpriced, useless metal sitting on property they could not legally touch. I did not go to Elias with empty sympathy or hollow words of encouragement. I went to him with a concrete lifeline. My maternal grandmother had passed away 2 years prior, leaving me a substantial, quiet inheritance. I had never touched a single cent of it, living purely on my quarry wages and funneling every spare dollar into discreet, extremely conservative mutual funds and local real estate trusts. Combined, I had amassed enough liquid capital to make a serious, aggressive move. I established a completely separate, airtight legal entity. I named it Davis Mineral Holdings. Through this holding company, I approached Elias and offered to purchase those core, foundational assets outright. We sat in his dimly lit, wood-paneled office late one evening, the distant hum of a solitary water pump echoing from the pit. Elias, the banks do not want your aging loaders, and they certainly do not care about the legacy of the name on your letterhead. I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. They want hard collateral. They want the dirt. He looked at me, his face deeply lined with utter exhaustion and a touch of disbelief. And you have the capital to buy the dirt. Piper, a pit manager. I have enough to buy the mineral rights, the retention lake, and the parcel footprints for the batch plants. I replied evenly, I will form a holding company. I will buy the core assets outright. In return, I will lease it all back to Blackridge at a rate low enough to get the banks off your throat. We will structure an incredibly complex deferred payment contract, backed by my cash and my personal guarantee. You get to keep your company alive. I get a long-term, hard asset investment. In exchange for selling me the absolute literal foundation of his company, I gave Elias the one thing he needed most: survival. Blackridge would be allowed to continue operating on my land, mining my stone, and using my water at a heavily discounted, highly favorable lease rate. It was a massive influx of clean capital that immediately satisfied the predatory commercial banks and allowed Elias to keep the lights on and the crushers running. He avoided complete bankruptcy by the narrowest of margins. It was a lifeline he grabbed with both hands, pride completely swallowed. I am a quarry manager, not a corporate lawyer. For the flawless legal execution, I relied entirely on Lila Hart. Lila was sharp, ruthless, and possessed a mind that functioned like a steel trap. She sat across from me in a cramped, badly lit diner on the outskirts of town a week later, sliding the thick stack of final contracts across the scratched Formica table. I buried the dead man switch in Section 4. Paragraph 12. Subsection C. Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper, tapping a manicured fingernail against the dense stack of paper. It is buried under so much operational jargon about site safety and technical aggregate extraction standards that those frantic corporate lawyers will never spot it. They are too busy trying to save the ship from sinking today to worry about hitting a legal iceberg a decade from now. Explain the exact trigger to me one more time, I asked. tracing the rim of my heavy ceramic coffee mug. If they ever fire you without ironclad, legally defensible cause, or if they try to sideline you and strip your operational authority to effectively force you out, the clock starts ticking immediately. Lila explained, her eyes locking onto mine. The master lease agreement, the water access, the mining rights, everything evaporates. They will have exactly 96 hours before they are legally trespassing on your land. It is not just a standard severance protection package, Piper. It is a loaded gun pointed directly at the floorboards they are currently standing on. Elias Mercer signed the documents with a heavy, trembling hand, perfectly aware of what he was doing and the immense power he was handing over. However, he fiercely insisted on keeping the true nature of the transaction an absolute, closely guarded secret from everyone, especially his own ambitious family. He knew with absolute certainty that if his ruthless children and entitled nephews found out he had sold the actual ground out from under their presumed inheritance to a blue-collar pit manager, the internal family warfare would have violently destroyed whatever was left of his legacy. He buried the master paperwork in a highly private, ironclad trust. As for me, I never breathed a single word of it to anyone. I did not need the public glory of being the financial savior of Blackridge. I did not want the festering resentment of the upper management or the awkward, shifting dynamics it would instantly cause with my hard-working crews. I was perfectly content to put my hard hat back on, walk back down into the abrasive dust, and do the physical job I truly loved. I let the executives keep their shiny titles, their expensive company cars, and their comforting illusion of total control. Over the next 7 years, a slow, inevitable turnover changed the face of the company. Elias eventually stepped back entirely, his health fading, taking the truth with him into his quiet, isolated retirement. The old guard was slowly replaced by a new, aggressive breed of corporate managers who only looked at digital balance sheets and quarterly profit margins. Grant Mercer and his polished friends arrived, completely blind to the vital history buried beneath their feet. They looked out their expansive glass windows at the massive quarry, the roaring batch plants, and the sprawling industrial operations, and they naturally assumed it all belonged unconditionally to the Blackridge corporate entity. They never once bothered to dig deep enough into the archaic, dusty property records at the county courthouse. If they had spent even one afternoon doing their due diligence, they would have seen the quiet, undeniable truth sitting right there in the public files. For 7 long years, the heavy property taxes, the strict state mining permits, the massive environmental compliance bonds, and the master land deeds were all registered, paid in full, and legally held under one single, solitary name: mine. It took less than 24 hours for Grant Mercer to begin his grand theatrical production of corporate dominance. By 8 o'clock the very next morning, he had physically moved his operation out of his sterile executive tower and down into my old operational office at the edge of the pit. It was not enough for him to simply fire me. He possessed a desperate, pathological need to perform his victory for the audience of laborers who still answered to my ghost. He turned my modest, wood-paneled workspace into a stage for his latest Culture Refresh campaign. By noon, a highly edited, dramatically lit short video was blasted across the company intranet portal. I did not need to log into the corporate network to see it. 6 furious equipment operators texted the file directly to my personal phone. The video was a masterclass in corporate arrogance. It opened with a slow, deliberate panning shot of my heavy brass nameplate being carelessly tossed into a cheap, brown cardboard box. The camera then lingered on a small, pathetic potted plant he had placed on my old desk, before flashing a sleek, digitally rendered slogan across the screen, "From dust to data." It was a calculated humiliation, but Grant was just getting warmed up. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, he called a mandatory all-hands meeting for the entire operational staff. He forced the men and women who actually crushed the stone, the ones covered in grease and limestone powder, to stand in the sweltering heat near the heavy maintenance bays while he stood elevated on a makeshift plywood stage. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit with a brand new, stiff yellow safety vest draped over his shoulders like a theatrical costume. He spoke to them as if they were uneducated children. He publicly dissected my legacy, calling my 2 decades of blood and sweat a toxic relic of a bygone era. He told my crews that I represented an outdated way of running the quarry. He proudly announced that the days of making decisions based on the smell of the dirt were over, replaced by algorithms and remote efficiency metrics. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the maintenance yard. Many of the younger laborers kept their mouths firmly shut and their eyes glued to the toes of their steel-toed boots, paralyzed by the very real fear of losing their paychecks in the middle of the season. But Grant made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed their silence was a sign of submission. He did not understand that working-class silence is rarely an agreement. It is usually a loaded spring. Mara Coleman certainly did not submit. Mara was the veteran foreman of the secondary crushing and screening division. She had worked at Blackridge for 15 years, possessed hands like scarred leather, and commanded more respect on the quarry floor than any executive ever could. While Grant was pacing the stage and boasting about his data-driven revolution, Mara stood casually in the back row, her arms crossed, hidden carefully behind the sleeve of her heavy canvas jacket. Her phone was recording every single arrogant, defamatory word that fell from his mouth. Before Grant even stepped down from the plywood stage, Mara had securely encrypted the audio file and a dozen screenshots of his boastful intranet posts, sending them directly to my private email. She added a single, short text message. "Tell me when to drop the hammer. Boss." I did not reply to her text. I did not post a frantic defense on social media. I did not call Elias Mercer to beg for my job back. Anger is loud, but a true execution is entirely silent. I picked up my car keys, drove 30 miles away from the choking dust of the quarry, and walked into a small, greasy roadside diner called the Rusty Spoon. Lila Hart was already sitting in a cracked red vinyl booth all the way in the back, nursing a mug of black coffee. She looked utterly out of place in her sharp, expensive charcoal blazer among the tired truckers and highway workers, but Lila only cared about results, not scenery. I slid into the booth opposite her and placed my phone flat on the sticky Formica table, hitting play on the audio file Mara had just sent me. We sat in complete silence, listening to Grant Mercer's voice echo tinnily from the small speaker, publicly degrading my operational authority and firmly establishing his undisputed control over the site. When the recording finally clicked off, Lila took a slow, methodical sip of her coffee. A sharp, dangerous smile crept onto her face. He could not have given us a more perfect breach of the operational covenant if we had written the script for him, Lila said, her voice a low, thrilling purr of legal anticipation. He just publicly admitted to terminating you strictly to seize operational control, explicitly stating that your management of the physical asset was the barrier to his new corporate strategy. The cause is documented. The trigger is officially pulled. I want the termination notices drafted immediately, I told her, my voice devoid of any warmth. I want the 96-hour countdown clock to start ticking the absolute second the post office opens on Monday morning. Prepare the land use revocation, the water rights suspension, and the eviction notices for the primary batch plants. Lila nodded, already pulling a sleek silver laptop from her leather briefcase. It will be a bloodbath. Piper, once those certified letters hit the desks of the legal department, Blackridge will go into immediate cardiac arrest. Make sure the envelopes are thick, I replied coldly. As Lila began typing furiously, drafting the documents that would legally sever the lifeblood of the Blackridge empire, I stepped outside into the diner's empty parking lot. The humid afternoon air pressed down heavily as I scrolled through my contacts and dialed a number I had ignored for years. Naomi Reed answered on the second ring. She was the chief executive officer of Monarch Roadworks, our largest, most ruthless regional competitor. Naomi was a brilliant, predatory operator who had spent the last 5 years trying to poach me from Blackridge. Well, Naomi said, her voice crackling over the line with evident amusement. I heard the idiot prince finally push the gravel woman out the door. My condolences, Piper, or perhaps my congratulations. My offer for the vice president seat still stands. By the way, name your salary. I am not calling for a job. Naomi, I said, leaning against the hot metal of my truck door. I am calling to verify a piece of market movement. Naomi paused, her tone instantly shifting from playful to sharp and professional. Go on. What is Blackridge doing with the Tri-County Autumn infrastructure packages? I asked. The bids are due next week. A low, dry chuckle rumbled from Naomi's end of the phone. Your boy Grant is losing his absolute mind. That is what he is doing. He is currently floating preliminary bids that are 20% below the standard market floor. My estimators are pulling their hair out trying to understand his math. He is undercutting everyone on the heavy highway extensions. He is guaranteeing massive aggregate delivery at a price point that is mathematically impossible to sustain. I closed my eyes, the sheer scale of Grant's fatal hubris washing over me like a wave of ice water. The pieces of the puzzle snapped into place. He is bidding as if his material costs are completely static, Naomi continued, completely unaware of the absolute devastation she was confirming. He is pricing those massive contracts firmly believing he has an endless, uninterrupted, effectively free supply of limestone sitting right in his own backyard. Thank you, Naomi, I said softly. I owe you a drink. Just tell me you are going to make him bleed. Piper, she said before hanging up. I lowered the phone from my ear and stared out at the empty highway. Grant had not just insulted the wrong person. He had not just fired the only manager who truly understood the logistics of the pit. Blinded by his own immense ego and his shiny new executive title, he had just bet the entire financial future of Blackridge Materials and Paving on a massive, unforgiving series of state contracts. He had placed the entire company on a precarious, high-stakes bridge, confident that the foundation beneath his feet was solid rock. He was about to find out, in exactly 96 hours, that he did not own a single grain of that rock, and the bridge he was standing on was about to collapse into the dust. Exactly at 8 o'clock on Monday morning, a synchronized fleet of independent couriers walked into 6 separate administrative lobbies across the region. Lila Hart had orchestrated the simultaneous delivery with the ruthless, unforgiving precision of a military strike. The thick, heavy manila envelopes were handed over at the exact same moment. One went directly to the polished reception desk of the towering executive building. Another was handed to the bewildered security guard at the main quarry gate. 2 more were delivered to the dispatch trailers at the primary asphalt and concrete batch plants. The 5th was dropped squarely on the desk of the regional director of the surety company that underwrote every single construction performance bond Blackridge held. And the final envelope, the deadliest one of all, was placed directly into the trembling hands of Owen Pike, the senior in-house corporate counsel for Blackridge Materials and Paving. Inside those heavy envelopes was not a simple, angry grievance letter from a disgruntled former employee. It was an absolute, apocalyptic legal bomb. I had instructed Lila to include absolutely everything. The package contained the formal, irrevocable notice of absolute termination of all land and water use agreements, effective at the exact expiration of the 96-hour clause triggered by my termination. But it went much deeper than a simple eviction notice. Attached were the certified, state-stamped cadastral maps with stark red lines clearly highlighting the true property boundaries. There was a flawless, unbroken chain of title transfers dating back 7 years. There were hundreds of pages of county tax receipts, all paid in full by Davis Mineral Holdings. There were the active, highly regulated state environmental mining permits, all registered strictly under my personal limited liability company. And finally, there was a heavily highlighted, indisputable appendix detailing the exclusive ownership of the industrial water lake system. I was not in the room when Owen Pike opened his envelope, but Mara Coleman had friends in the administrative pool who gave me the exact play-by-play later that evening. Owen, a man who usually projected an aura of unshakable legal boredom, casually sliced the seal open while sipping his morning coffee. As he scanned the first page, his posture stiffened. By the 3rd page, he dropped his expensive pen onto his mahogany desk. He frantically turned to his computer monitor, his fingers hammering the keyboard as he logged directly into the public county property database to desperately verify the catastrophic claims. He typed in the parcel identification numbers for the active pit. He typed in the geological coordinates for the batch plants. He checked the commercial water rights registry. Every single query returned the exact same terrifying, undeniable result. The legal descriptions matched perfectly. The names matched perfectly. It was an ironclad, impenetrable fortress of property law. His face went completely pale, the blood draining from his cheeks as he realized the massive corporate entity he represented was currently standing on thin air. Grant Mercer barged into the legal department 20 minutes later, his face flushed with irritation, but still stubbornly clinging to his massive, unearned ego. He had received his copy of the envelope and tossed it onto Owen's desk like a piece of meaningless trash. "This is completely pathetic," Grant sneered, yanking his expensive silk tie straight. "She is just throwing a temper tantrum because I pushed her out. Let the gravel woman keep her dirty hole in the ground. We will simply buy our crushed limestone from the independent quarry across the county line. Draft a restraining order to keep her off the active site, Owen, and let us get back to work." Owen did not even look at his keyboard to begin drafting a restraining order. He looked up at his arrogant new boss with the hollow, terrified eyes of a man who had just watched his own executioner sharpen the axe. "You do not understand, Grant," Owen said, his voice trembling slightly in the quiet room. "It is not just the raw stone in the ground. Read the certified parcel maps. She owns the primary haul roads. Our fleet of 60 transport trucks cannot legally drive from the loading zone to the public highway without committing criminal trespass. She owns the land directly beneath the commercial way station. She owns the deep water reservoir required to wash the aggregate and run the dust suppression sprayers. If we operate those crushers for even 1 hour without her water, the state environmental agency will shut us down and issue millions in regulatory fines. Grant, she even owns the specific acre of dirt sitting directly underneath the east wing of our own quality control testing laboratory." While Grant stood completely frozen in the legal office, the suffocating panic began to spread like a wildfire through his newly appointed data-driven management team. Down in the logistics department, the replacement managers were frantically trying to access the material certification database to figure out how to import external stone. They typed in their administrative passwords, but the screens flashed red and locked them out. They frantically called the software vendor, demanding immediate administrative access to their own quality control metrics. The vendor's polite response sent a shockwave of sheer terror through the room. The enterprise software, tracking the aggregate gradation, the internal moisture content, and the critical state compliance certifications, was not contracted with Blackridge. The massive monthly licensing fees for the proprietary tracking system had been paid directly by my private holding company for the last 4 years. I did not just own the physical dirt, I owned the exact digital data Grant worshipped. Without those digital certifications, not a single state inspector would ever allow a Blackridge truck to pour a single yard of concrete on a government highway job. A desperate, screaming emergency meeting was convened in the executive boardroom. The air conditioning was running on high, but men in incredibly expensive suits were sweating entirely through their shirts. A frantic, bleeding-edge plan was proposed to import compliant stone from a massive corporate quarry 200 miles away, eating the astronomical freight costs and destroying their profit margins just to keep the contracts alive. But the seasoned project managers, the few experienced ones Grant had not yet managed to fire in his restructuring purge, quickly crushed that desperate hope. The massive autumn infrastructure packages, the very contracts Grant had aggressively underbid just days prior, were governed by strict Department of Transportation regulations. The structural aggregate for those specific jobs had been rigorously pre-tested and pre-approved based entirely on the unique geological friction coefficients of my specific limestone deposit. You cannot simply swap out a state-approved mix design overnight because you lost your property lease. Getting a new quarry stone approved for a major federal highway requires new core drilling, weeks of independent laboratory friction testing, and endless bureaucratic safety approvals. They did not have weeks. Thanks to the countdown timer Lila had baked perfectly into the contract, they had hours. sitting at my kitchen island, miles away from the corporate meltdown. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct number for the quarry floor. Mara Coleman answered immediately, shouting over the deafening, beautiful roar of the active machinery. "Mara," I said, my voice projecting calm, absolute authority through the chaotic industrial noise. "I want you to run one final, controlled shift. Clear the heavy rubber conveyor belt so the stagnant weight does not warp the steel rollers. Empty out the primary jaw crusher so massive boulders do not get jammed in the teeth. Run clean water through the batch plant mixing drums so the residual concrete does not set and ruin the iron. Do everything safely, strictly by the book, and make sure every single crew member gets their full hourly pay for the day." "And then," Mara asked, a fierce, knowing grin clearly audible in her tone. "And then, the absolute second that 96-hour clock strikes 0 on Thursday afternoon, you walk directly into the main electrical housing," I commanded. "You throw the master breakers. You power down the entire site." "Understood, boss," she replied, and ended the call. By the time the sun began to set on that chaotic, frantic Monday, a heavy, undeniable reality had settled over the entire valley. The toxic rumors had leaked from the sealed executive tower, bleeding down to the maintenance bays, and spreading rapidly out to the local competitors, the arrogant executives, the panicked board members, and the industry rivals, who had initially thought I was just an angry, discarded employee throwing a desperate legal tantrum, finally understood the breathtaking scale of what was happening. I was not an emotional woman angrily burning down the bridges of my former employer to get petty revenge. I was a property owner calmly, methodically reaching out and locking a heavy steel door. A door that, despite all their arrogant assumptions and expensive degrees, had never, not for a single second in the last 7 years, belonged to Blackridge. I never possessed any desire to simply burn a corporate empire to the ground out of raw, unbridled emotion. Vengeance, when driven purely by anger, is a remarkably messy and ultimately unprofitable endeavor. My entire career had been built on the precise, calculated processing of raw materials, and I approached my severance with the exact same methodical mindset. I was not destroying the board. I was entirely rearranging the pieces to reflect the actual, undeniable ownership of the physical ground. My immediate concern, however, was not the panicked executives bleeding out in their glass tower. My primary focus was firmly fixed on the men and women whose heavy boots were currently coated in the dust of my quarry. If the Blackridge operational structure collapsed overnight, hundreds of hardworking families would suddenly lose their vital paychecks, their healthcare benefits, and their stability right before the turning of the season. I absolutely refused to allow the people who had loyally kept my crushers running through freezing rain and blistering heat to become disposable collateral damage in Grant Mercer's breathtakingly arrogant game of corporate posturing. I needed to construct a massive, secure landing pad for them before the final floorboards gave way. Late into Tuesday evening, while the Blackridge legal department was undoubtedly still spiraling into a state of total paralyzed panic, I was sitting comfortably in the sleek, ultra-modern executive boardroom of Monarch Roadworks. Naomi Reed sat directly across the polished mahogany expanse from me, tapping a silver pen against a thick stack of freshly printed legal contracts. The negotiation was incredibly fast, entirely brutal, and mutually beneficial. We hammered out a devastatingly simple, airtight agreement. Monarch Roadworks would immediately receive the highly coveted, exclusive right to purchase every single ton of processed aggregate that was pulled out of my property. In exchange for that massive competitive advantage, Davis Mineral Holdings retained absolute, unquestioned, and total authority over the physical extraction processes, the rigorous environmental safety protocols, and the technical crushing operations. I was not selling my quarry to a new corporate overlord. I was securing a massive, fiercely reliable distributor for my privately owned product. Before I picked up the heavy black fountain pen to sign the master document, I leaned forward and looked Naomi dead in the eye. "I have one absolute, non-negotiable condition," I told her, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet, cavernous room. When the heavy steel gates permanently lock at the Black Ridge facility on Thursday afternoon, your paving and logistics divisions are going to desperately need a massive, immediate influx of highly experienced labor to handle the sudden, violent surge in material demand. You will prioritize the immediate, seamless hiring of my former operational crews. You will take my heavy-haul tandem truck drivers, my specialized diesel mechanics, my loader operators, and my quality control laboratory technicians. You will match their current seniority, and you will honor their pay scales. I will not allow the people who actually built the physical foundation of that empire to suffer because their new boss wanted to play dress-up in a clean office. Naomi did not even blink. She knew the immense, irreplaceable value of a fully trained, deeply loyal heavy industrial crew. She nodded once, and the deal was permanently sealed. By the time the sun rose on Wednesday morning, the quiet, highly organized exodus had already begun. Mara Coleman, my fiercely loyal secondary crushing foreman, was the very first person to officially sign the transition paperwork. She brought with her an encyclopedic, instinctual knowledge of the complex screening circuits that no textbook could ever teach. Ronan Bell, the meticulously obsessive head of the Quality Control Testing Laboratory, calmly packed up his personal reference binders, boxed up his specialized graduation sieves, and walked out the door before his scheduled lunch break without saying a single word to his new corporate supervisors. Tessa Moore, the brilliant, sharp-tongued dispatch coordinator who could flawlessly juggle the routing of 60 heavily loaded transport trucks in her sleep, quietly rerouted her personal communication lines and joined our growing ranks. These people were the actual beating heart of the entire heavy industrial operation. They represented the vital, living human infrastructure that Grant arrogantly, foolishly believed could be seamlessly replaced by a few colorful digital dashboards and a cloud-based efficiency algorithm. When they walked away, they took the true operational capacity of the company with them, leaving behind nothing but empty metal shells and thoroughly confused middle managers. Because I retained the precise, historical aggregate gradation schedules, the detailed geological blast logs, the strict preventative maintenance timelines, and the exact, highly specialized material requirements for every single active construction site in the entire county. Monarch Roadworks absorbed the massive market shockwave instantly. We restarted the complex supply chain in a fraction of the time anyone in the heavy construction industry thought mathematically possible. We were actively loading Monarch transport trucks with premium, state-approved, high-friction limestone before the dust had even managed to settle on my recently vacated property. Across the valley, Grant Mercer was actively drowning in the deep waters of his own spectacular hubris. Desperate to keep his massively underbid, financially crippling highway contracts alive, he panicked. He frantically purchased thousands of tons of recycled concrete aggregate and hastily imported cheap sedimentary rock from a deeply subpar, heavily discounted supplier located 2 states away. He authorized the massive freight invoices, blindly assuming that any gray rock could simply be substituted for another. It was a catastrophic, amateur mistake that permanently sealed his professional coffin. When the veteran State Department of Transportation engineers arrived at the active paving sites to run their strict, mandatory quality assurance field tests, the physical results were an absolute bloodbath. The imported stone completely failed the rigid Los Angeles abrasion resistance metrics, crumbling into useless powder under the heavy steel testing cylinders. It violently shattered under the severe simulated freeze and thaw durability protocols. The particle size gradation was so wildly, dangerously inconsistent that the freshly laid asphalt mix resembled a crumbling, loose gravel driveway rather than a high-speed, load-bearing interstate surface. The state inspectors did not hesitate. They immediately shut down 3 of Blackridge's largest, most lucrative municipal paving sites in a single afternoon. They aggressively red-tagged the imported material piles, legally barring them from being used on any government project, and issued massive, compounding daily non-compliance financial penalties that instantly began bleeding the corporate accounts dry. Cornered, like a desperate animal and bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate, Grant attempted to violently seize control of the public narrative. He heavily utilized his expensive corporate public relations firm to aggressively seed toxic, defamatory rumors throughout the local trade associations and business chambers. He desperately tried to paint me as a vindictive, unstable, rogue former employee who was maliciously destroying her beloved former company out of pure, unhinged emotional spite. He loudly claimed to anyone who would listen that I was actively sabotaging the critical regional infrastructure out of petty personal jealousy over being let go. But the seasoned industry veterans, the gruff commercial project managers, and the hardened, weather-beaten site superintendents did not buy a single, polished word of his frantic corporate spin. They knew exactly how the heavy civil construction world actually functioned. They saw through the expensive suits and the carefully crafted press releases. They knew the fundamental truth of the matter. I had not broken a single piece of Black Ridge machinery. I had not illegally poached a single client contract. I had not destroyed a single asset that rightfully belonged to their corporate entity. I had simply, entirely legally, and permanently stopped allowing them to stand on the physical ground that belonged exclusively to me. In less than one single week, the entire gravitational pull of the regional construction market had fundamentally, violently shifted. I had walked out of that freezing, sterile glass executive office as a discarded, publicly humiliated middle manager, clutching a pathetic severance envelope that was meant to be my quiet funeral. Now standing firmly on the solid stone of my own quarry, sitting firmly at the helm of my own sovereign supply chain, I was the absolute, undisputed kingmaker. From a woman casually kicked out the door and branded with a derogatory nickname, I had become the only person within a 200-mile radius who possessed the raw material, the certified data, and the fiercely loyal personnel required to keep the massive, multi-million-dollar public infrastructure projects alive. The balance of power had not just tilted, it had completely inverted. The silence was the loudest sound the valley had heard in 40 years. When the 96-hour deadline officially expired on Thursday afternoon, Mara Coleman walked into the main electrical control room and threw the heavy master breakers. The deafening, bone-rattling roar of the primary jaw crusher ground to a harsh, metallic halt. The massive secondary cone crushers spun down to a complete stop. The miles of heavy rubber conveyor belts rolled to a standstill. For the first time in over 4 decades, the Black Ridge active pit was entirely violently quiet. The deep, rhythmic vibration that usually hummed through the soles of every boot on the property simply ceased to exist. Almost instantly, the shockwave radiated outward from the silent quarry, hitting the massive construction sites across the county like a physical blow. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the phones in the Black Ridge Dispatch Center began to ring. It started as a steady trickle, then rapidly escalated into a deafening, chaotic symphony of ringing plastic. Commercial site superintendents, standing on half-milled highway lanes with paving crews idling on the clock, were screaming into their radios. They were demanding to know where their tandem trucks were. Asphalt cools quickly, and a delayed truck meant ruined material, blown deadlines, and massive financial penalties. The dispatchers, permanently locked out of their logistics software and staring at completely empty loading lanes, had absolutely nothing to tell them. The institutional collapse was swift and completely merciless. The Southern Corridor Authority, the massive governmental agency overseeing the region's most critical infrastructure developments, did not wait for a corporate apology or a public relations spin. By Friday morning, they issued immediate, formal stop work orders across 4 different multi-million-dollar highway packages. Black Ridge could no longer mathematically or legally prove their capacity to supply the strictly certified aggregate. In the heavy civil construction world, if you cannot definitively prove your unbroken supply chain, you do not get to touch the public asphalt. The bleeding did not stop at the active paving sites. The panic violently infected the financial sector. The massive corporate surety company, the institutional guarantor that underwrote every single performance bond Black Ridge required to legally bid on municipal work, officially withdrew their financial backing. An emergency letter was couriered to the executive board, stating flatly that until the severe land dispute and the complete loss of material assets were completely resolved. Blackridge was officially considered an uninsurable risk. Without bonding capacity, Grant could not even bid on a local pothole repair contract, let alone a state highway. He had not just lost the present quarter, he had instantly, irreversibly lost the company's entire future. Blood was clearly in the water, and the industrial suppliers smelled it immediately. For decades, Blackridge had operated on highly comfortable net 30 or net 60-day credit terms for their massive logistical needs. That institutional trust vanished overnight. The regional diesel fuel purveyors, the chemical additive suppliers who provided the vital binding agents for the asphalt plants, and the heavy equipment leasing companies all simultaneously changed their strict billing structures. They universally demanded cash on delivery. If a Blackridge manager wanted fuel for the remaining idle loaders or parts for a broken engine, they had to produce a cleared bank wire transfer before the delivery trucks would even shift into gear. The corporate cash reserves, already severely strained by Grant's reckless underbidding strategy, began to instantly evaporate. Inside the sterile glass executive tower, the walls were rapidly closing in on Grant Mercer. The panicked board of directors convened an emergency session, hauling him in to explain the catastrophic implosion. It was during this brutal, screaming interrogation that Owen Pike, the terrified in-house counsel, broke ranks to save his own legal license. He confessed to the furious board that Grant had received the formal termination notice on Monday morning but had deliberately hidden the apocalyptic legal threat from the directors for almost half a day. Grant had arrogantly assumed he could quietly sweep my legal maneuver under the rug, completely squandering the only precious hours the board had to attempt a desperate early negotiation or establish a genuine contingency plan. The final nail in Grant's coffin came from within his own inner circle. A disgruntled senior accountant, terrified of losing her pension in the impending bankruptcy, anonymously leaked a highly classified internal expenditure report to the entire board. The spreadsheet was a damning, undeniable testament to Grant's fatal vanity. It meticulously detailed how he had utterly hemorrhaged the quarterly operational budget. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a flashy corporate rebranding campaign, a massive redesign of the executive office suites featuring imported Italian leather furniture, and a completely useless digital image consultancy. Simultaneously, the exact same spreadsheet clearly showed that he had intentionally delayed critical, heavily requested preventative maintenance on the primary rock crushers and the hauling fleet to artificially inflate his short-term profit margins. He had starved the heavy workhorses to buy silk saddles for the executives. The sheer scale of the disaster finally reached the one man who had desperately tried to outrun it. Elias Mercer, frail but still possessing the sharp, calculating eyes of a former industrial titan, was driven back to the corporate headquarters he had sworn to leave behind in his retirement. He did not go up to the glass tower to join the screaming matches. He told his driver to stop the luxury sedan in the massive, sweltering employee parking lot. Elias slowly stepped out of the air-conditioned car, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. He stood in the oppressive heat and looked out over the expansive, terrifyingly silent quarry. He looked at the idle yellow machines, the empty conveyor belts, and the perfectly still water of the retention lake. For the very first time, standing in the shadow of the massive empire he had painstakingly built from the dirt up, Elias realized his own catastrophic failure. He had handed the heavy keys to a grandson he thought was highly educated and perfectly polished, completely failing to realize that the boy had absolutely no understanding of what actually kept the company alive. Grant truly believed the company was the sleek logo, the digital data, and the tailored suits. He never understood that the entire empire relied entirely on the dirt, the stone, and the rough hands of the people who moved it. While the Blackridge Empire violently fractured and collapsed under the immense weight of its own arrogance, a massive domino effect swept through the commercial sector. Every single major contractor who relied on Blackridge for their daily survival began jumping ship. Loyalty in the construction business only extends exactly as far as the next concrete pour. My personal cell phone, sitting on the granite kitchen counter of my modest home, began to ring, It rang continuously, hour after hour. I was answering calls from desperate commercial project managers, seasoned site foremen, and municipal engineers. They did not care about corporate synergy. They did not care about Grant Mercer's data-driven vision or his beautifully polished office. They were men and women standing on dusty dirt lots with millions of dollars on the line, and they simply wanted one highly practical, undeniable thing. They needed their raw materials to arrive exactly on time. Piper, a gruff, exhausted voice echoed through the speaker as I answered the seventh call of the hour. It was the lead superintendent for a massive commercial shopping center development on the edge of the city. I have 40 men standing around doing absolutely nothing, and Blackridge just told me they cannot deliver my base rock for the next 2 weeks. Can Monarch Roadworks meet my tonnage by tomorrow morning? Send me your exact material specifications and your required delivery schedule, I replied, my voice calm, steady, and entirely in control. We will have the first 10 trucks pulling onto your site before the sun comes up. The massive, unstoppable shift in power was complete. I was no longer the discarded employee fighting for scraps. I was the solid, unshakable ground they all desperately needed to build upon. Grant had run out of fast capital, and desperate men always turn to the courts when their checkbooks fail. On a humid Tuesday morning, his high-priced legal team filed an emergency preliminary injunction in the county civil court. Their desperate strategy was built on a complete, absolute fabrication. They formally claimed that Davis Mineral Holdings was nothing more than a temporary informal trust, an administrative shell company established solely to shield Blackridge assets during a prior financial crisis. They argued that my decision to lock the gates was a malicious breach of fiduciary duty and demanded the judge issue a mandatory order forcing me to immediately reopen the quarry, while the larger ownership dispute slowly made its way through the legal system. The county courthouse was a heavy, imposing structure of polished marble and dark oak. Grant arrived surrounded by 4 sharply dressed corporate litigators, projecting an aura of aggressive, manufactured confidence. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors with only Lila Hart by my side. She was pulling a single, reinforced leather rolling briefcase. She looked like a predator walking casually into a cage full of very slow, very expensive mice. Grant's lead attorney, a man who spoke with the practiced, theatrical cadence of a television lawyer, stood before the judge. He painted a tragic, entirely fictional picture. He described me as a rogue, disgruntled employee who had hijacked the company's vital lifeblood over a minor managerial dispute. He claimed the stone in the ground fundamentally belonged to the Blackridge corporate family and that my legal maneuvering was an illegal hostage situation. He begged the court to force the machines back on. When the attorney finally sat down, looking quite pleased with his dramatic performance, Lila Hart stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not employ theatrical hand gestures. She simply began to unpack her leather briefcase. "Your Honor," Lila began, her voice crisp and echoing sharply in the quiet courtroom. The plaintiff's entire argument relies on the premise that my client was operating a temporary, informal trust. I would like to submit Exhibit A into the public record. Lila handed a thick, bound stack of papers to the court bailiff. These are the certified county property tax receipts for the entire quarry footprint, the haul roads, and the industrial water lake. For 7 consecutive years, every single dollar of property tax has been paid directly from the private accounts of Davis Mineral Holdings. Blackridge has not paid a single dime in property taxes since the original transfer. Furthermore, Exhibit B contains the certified bank wire transfers proving the deferred purchase payments made by my client to save Blackridge from total insolvency. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his heavy wooden chair. His lead attorney quickly stood up to object, claiming tax payments did not magically negate the existence of an implied trust. Lila did not even break her rhythm. If the plaintiff requires explicit intent, I submit Exhibit C. She held up a series of brightly highlighted, heavily authenticated email printouts. These are internal, time-stamped communications from the late Elias Mercer, the founder of Blackridge, directed to his senior financial officers. In these emails, Mr. Mercer explicitly states, and I quote, "We are selling the ground to Piper. It is a permanent transfer, a hard sale, and the only way we avoid total bankruptcy today." End quote. There was no temporary trust. Your Honor, there was a desperate sale, and my client was the only buyer. The judge, a stern man with silver hair and a very low tolerance for corporate games, adjusted his reading glasses and scanned through the emails. The silence in the room grew incredibly heavy. But the devastating reality of Blackridge's legal position does not stop at the current pit boundary. Lila continued, her voice taking on a sharper, far more dangerous edge. "I would like to direct the court's attention to a specific addendum in the master lease agreement, one the new Blackridge management team apparently failed to read." She pulled a single, red-bordered document from her briefcase. I watched Owen Pike, the Blackridge in-house counsel sitting directly behind Grant, turn the exact color of wet ash. According to the operational lease, Lila stated, Blackridge was required to pay a quarterly royalty fee for the extraction rights in the eastern sector. If that payment was ever delayed by more than 30 days, it automatically triggered a unilateral purchase option for Davis Mineral Holdings to acquire the massive, unmined expanded reserve zone. Last quarter, under the direct orders of Mr. Grant Mercer, Blackridge delayed all vendor and royalty payments by 45 days to artificially inflate their quarterly cash flow reports. Lila placed the document firmly on the podium. My client legally exercised that option exactly 46 days ago. She does not just own the current active quarry. She legally owns the next 20 years of unmined limestone reserves. Blackridge is not just locked out of their present. They have been completely evicted from their own future. Grant slammed his fist down on the defense table, his composure completely shattering. She was fired for cause. She was an outdated, insubordinate manager. This entire contract termination is based on a fraudulent premise. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down, demanding immediate order in his court. Lila smiled. It was a cold, terrifying expression. "I am so glad opposing counsel brought up the termination, Your Honor. They claim this was an objective, data-driven corporate restructuring. I submit Exhibit D, an audio recording taken by a senior foreman during a mandatory company meeting held less than 24 hours after my client was escorted from the premises." Lila connected her silver laptop to the courtroom audio system. Suddenly, Grant Mercer's own arrogant, booming voice filled the high-ceilinged room. "We are moving from dust to data," the recorded voice of Grant boasted, echoing off the marble walls. "I had to push Piper out before the state certification renewal season hit next month. I needed to cut her influence off at the knees before she could lock in the new operational standards. She is just the gravel woman, and we do not need her kind of dirt in this office anymore." The recording clicked off. The absolute silence that followed was entirely suffocating. Grant stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He had just heard himself publicly admit to terminating a senior executive not for objective performance issues, but as a calculated, malicious strategy to explicitly strip her of her operational influence. He had completely destroyed his own legal defense of a justified firing. The 96-hour termination clause was not an unconscionable penalty. It was a perfectly triggered, legally sound defense mechanism against his own documented malice. The judge did not need to deliberate for long. He closed the heavy legal binders on his desk and looked directly at the Blackridge legal team with an expression of profound disgust. "The plaintiff's request for an emergency preliminary injunction is denied in its entirety," the judge ruled, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "The court finds no evidence whatsoever of an implied trust. The ownership documents are absolute, clear, and legally undisputed. Furthermore, based on the audio evidence presented, the termination of the defendant was clearly executed with specific intent to sever her operational authority, thereby cleanly triggering the termination of the land use lease." The judge leaned forward, his hard gaze locking directly onto Grant. "I am issuing a very clear, very strict warning to Blackridge Materials and Paving. The disputed property legally belongs to Davis Mineral Holdings. If you attempt to breach those gates, if you attempt to turn on a single rock crusher, or if you drive a single transport truck onto that land, you will not face a civil penalty. You will be arrested for criminal trespass. We are adjourned. The gavel struck the sounding block like a heavy gunshot. Lila calmly packed her documents back into her leather briefcase. We walked out of the courtroom together, leaving Grant and his highly paid lawyers sitting in stunned, silent defeat. The preliminary hearing did not technically end the entire war. A full, exhaustive civil trial to completely settle the corporate divorce could theoretically take years of tedious litigation. But the injunction was the immediate battle that mattered, and the heavy construction industry does not wait for final verdicts. By the time we reached the asphalt of the courthouse parking lot, the news of the denied injunction had already hit the local commercial wires. The heavy civil construction market understood one absolute, terrifying truth. I was not just an angry woman acting out of emotional spite or hurt feelings. I possessed the original land deeds. I controlled the precise timing of the crisis, and I had the absolute weight of the law standing firmly by my side. I had not just defeated Grant Mercer in a boardroom. I had completely crushed him under the very legal foundation he had tried to weaponize against me. Elias Mercer asked to meet me at the eastern overlook, a jagged limestone ridge that sat 300 feet above the silent quarry floor. When I pulled my truck onto the gravel shoulder, the old man was already standing near the edge, leaning heavily on his carved wooden cane. The wind was whipping up from the massive, empty basin, carrying the faint, metallic scent of standing water and cold steel. "I spent 40 years digging this hole," Elias said softly, not looking away from the vast expanse of the pit. I truly believed that the sheer momentum of honest, back-breaking labor could serve as an impenetrable shield against the entitlement and greed of my own bloodline. I thought the dirt would keep them grounded. I was entirely wrong. Piper. I stood beside him, watching a solitary hawk circle the heavy equipment that sat paralyzed below us. I did not offer him any comforting lies. The silence between us was heavy with the weight of 7 years of unacknowledged truths. "We are bleeding to death, Piper," Elias continued, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound age and deep regret. "The board is in complete chaos. The banks are circling like vultures. I am asking you to come back. We will give you an executive vice president title. We will double your previous salary. You will have absolute, unquestioned operational control over every single machine and every single man on the payroll." It was the exact offer I would have killed for 10 years ago. It was the validation I had sweat blood to earn, but standing there, feeling the solid rock beneath my boots, rock that belonged entirely to me, the offer felt incredibly hollow. "I will not return to Blackridge to be an employee on the exact land that I own," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of anger. "I will not clock in to manage my own dirt. Elias, I'm not looking for a promotion. I'm looking at a hostile corporate entity trespassing on my property." Elias closed his eyes, leaning heavier onto his cane. "What do you want, Piper?" "Name your price. My conditions are absolute and entirely non-negotiable," I stated, staring straight ahead. "First, I require a formal, public retraction of the defamatory statements your grandson spread regarding my professional competence. Second, full compensation for the professional and reputational damage caused by the wrongful termination. Third, an ironclad, legally binding protection agreement for every single operational worker, ensuring their pensions and health care are fully funded before any executive bonuses are paid. Fourth, the immediate clearing of all outstanding accounts payable to the local vendors who have been starved by your recent financial mismanagement." I paused, letting the heavy wind fill the silence for a long moment. "And finally," I said, my tone turning to cold steel, "Grant Mercer is removed from the company, not reassigned, not given a golden parachute or a silent board seat. He is stripped of all executive authority. His corporate shares are entirely frozen, and he is escorted out of the building by security. If those conditions are not met in their entirety, the gates remain permanently locked." The demands sent a violent shockwave through the highest echelons of the Blackridge corporate structure. Through the vast, interconnected grapevine of the heavy construction industry, I heard exactly how the emergency meetings unfolded. The board of directors was viciously torn in half. One faction, composed of the older, battle-hardened financial veterans who clearly understood the apocalyptic reality of losing the physical quarry, desperately wanted to swallow their immense pride, sign my demands, and save whatever was left of the sinking ship. The opposing faction, a group of younger, image-obsessed executives loyal to Grant, fiercely argued that surrendering to a discarded quarry manager would permanently destroy their corporate leverage. They believed firing the founder's grandson to appease me would make them look incredibly weak to the commercial market, driven to the absolute brink of total ruin. Grant executed one final desperate gamble. He called a hasty press conference in the sterile lobby of the executive tower. Sweating under the bright camera lights, he proudly announced that Blackridge Materials and Paving had successfully secured a massive, exclusive long-term aggregate supply agreement with Desert Crest Minerals. He triumphantly declared that the company did not need my limestone, my water, or my land. He smiled for the cameras, insisting the crisis was completely over and that the data-driven future of Blackridge was perfectly secure. It was an act of breathtaking, suicidal arrogance. Every seasoned professional in the valley knew exactly what Desert Crest Minerals produced. They mined a deeply fractured, highly porous sandstone deposit located almost 100 miles past the county line. The market reaction was not a sigh of relief. It was an instantaneous execution. The very next morning, the independent engineering firms hired by the state arrived at the commercial batch plants to run the mandatory stress tests on the first heavily expedited shipments of Desert Crest rock. The physical results were an absolute catastrophe. The brittle, substandard stone completely pulverized under the heavy steel of the abrasion testing cylinders, filling the laboratory air with useless dust. The specific gravity was completely wrong, absorbing far too much liquid asphalt binder and creating a mix that was structurally compromised before it even left the mixing drum. The moment the certified laboratory failure reports were officially filed, the dominoes fell with terrifying speed. Two of the largest commercial developers in the state, companies that had been fiercely loyal to Blackridge for over 20 years, immediately formally canceled their massive, multi-million-dollar paving contracts. They simply could not risk pouring a completely defective foundation for their high-rise projects. Worse still, the disastrous test results triggered a fatal financial covenant. The primary commercial bank that held the massive revolving credit line for Blackridge issued a formal, terrifying letter of intent. Because the company had completely lost its ability to produce a viable, saleable product, the bank was actively preparing to call the entire massive corporate debt due in full by the end of the fiscal quarter. The pressure inside the valley reached an absolute boiling point on Wednesday night. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of an impending corporate death. Toxic, highly credible rumors spread like wildfire across the local trade associations and the late-night diner counters. The whispers confirmed that if the board of directors did not forcefully remove Grant Mercer and completely capitulate to my demands before the close of business on Friday, a massive venture capital firm was preparing to forcefully liquidate Blackridge. They were going to sell off the aging heavy trucks, auction the rusted crushing machinery for scrap metal, and permanently dissolve the 70-year-old family legacy. I sat alone in my dark living room that night, watching the distant, blinking red warning lights of the silent batch plant towers across the valley. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the frantic, nervous energy of someone hoping for a favorable settlement. I simply felt the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute certainty. When I finally closed my eyes to sleep, I knew exactly what awaited me the following morning. I was scheduled to walk into the final emergency board meeting. But I would not be walking through those heavy glass doors as a victim begging for a meager scrap of justice. I was not a woman looking for a simple apology. I was the absolute architect of their current reality. I held the original property deeds. I held the fiercely loyal operational staff. I held the rigid state contracts, and I held the unrelenting ticking clock. I grasped the solid, undeniable truth of the physical earth, a truth that arrogant men in expensive tailored suits had foolishly ignored for far too long. They had built their entire fragile kingdom on my ground, and tomorrow, I was finally going to pull the floor completely out from under them. The atmosphere inside the Black Ridge executive boardroom on Friday morning was so heavy, it felt as though the air itself had thickened. The long, polished mahogany table was surrounded by panicked, exhausted men and women who had not slept in over 48 hours. At the far end of the room sat the senior risk assessment officer from the primary commercial lending bank, his face a mask of absolute, unforgiving grimness. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors swung open, and Grant Mercer casually strolled into the room. It was a staggering display of pathological delusion. Despite the total operational shutdown, despite the blistering legal defeat in the county courthouse, and despite the millions of dollars in rapidly compounding state penalties, Grant still wore a smug, patronizing smile. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored suit and took his position at the head of the table. He looked at me, standing quietly at the opposite end with Lila Hart by my side, and he actually chuckled. "Well, Piper, you certainly know how to make a dramatic, expensive point," Grant said, leaning forward and resting his manicured hands on the polished wood. "You threw a massive wrench into the gears, terrified the shareholders, and made your displeasure abundantly clear. I admit, I underestimated your stubbornness, but the theatrics end today. We are prepared to offer you the title of Executive Vice President of Operations, a 60% base salary increase, and a brand new company vehicle. Now, let us shake hands, turn the crushers back on, and get back to making money." He genuinely believed the entire week of catastrophic market failure was nothing more than an elaborate, aggressive salary negotiation tactic. He thought I had simply brought his corporate empire to the brink of total annihilation just to secure a corner office and a slightly larger paycheck. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer him a single word of argument or debate. I simply unlatched my heavy leather portfolio and began placing the absolute, undeniable truth onto the table. "I am not here to negotiate a salary, Grant," I said, my voice cold, flat, and carrying the heavy weight of a judge reading a final sentence. I laid down the original certified county property deeds. I laid down the brilliantly concealed, heavily highlighted breach of contract clause. I placed a small black digital audio player on the table, the screen displaying the exact length of the recording where he proudly admitted to pushing me out strictly to sever my operational control. I laid down the certified banking receipts proving his intentional delay of the Eastern Reserve royalty payments. And finally, I placed the rigid, unyielding state environmental certification renewal schedule, the exact regulatory deadline he had arrogantly ignored, proving his newly imported stone was entirely illegal to use. Grant scoffed, leaning back in his chair and waving his hand dismissively at the paper trail. "We have a legion of corporate appellate lawyers. We will tie these documents up in the state civil courts for the next 10 years. You do not have the liquid capital to survive a decade-long legal war of attrition. Piper, take the job offer before I withdraw it entirely." That was the exact moment Lila Hart stepped forward to deliver the final, fatal blow. She did not look at Grant. She looked directly at the senior risk assessment officer from the commercial bank. "You will not be fighting a civil property dispute for 10 years, Mr. Mercer," Lila stated, her voice slicing through the boardroom like a razor blade. "You will be fighting federal fraud charges. On Monday morning, you were served with certified, undeniable legal notice that Black Ridge no longer possessed the physical assets, the raw materials, or the legal right to fulfill your commercial obligations. Yet, for 4 consecutive days, you deliberately concealed that catastrophic loss from this board of directors." Lila placed her hands firmly on the table, leaning slightly toward the terrified executives. "Worse still, even after knowing your supply chain had been legally severed, you continued submitting binding bids for state-funded highway projects. You personally signed legal guarantees of material capacity to the government and to your financial lenders, knowing those guarantees were entirely fraudulent. When a chief executive officer knowingly and deliberately misrepresents their material capacity to secure federal funds and maintain commercial credit lines, the corporate veil of limited liability completely evaporates. If Blackridge defaults today, the bank and the state will not just seize the company assets. They will seize your personal bank accounts, your private real estate, and they will pursue criminal charges for intentional corporate fraud. The color drained from Grant's face. The smug, patronizing smile finally shattered, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked frantically at his in-house legal counsel, but Owen Pike simply stared at the floor, absolutely refusing to make eye contact. The representative from the commercial bank slowly stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "The bank's position is completely uncompromising," the officer declared, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "If Grant Mercer is not fully removed from executive authority within the next 5 minutes, I will make a single phone call. The entire Blackridge revolving credit facility will be permanently frozen before 10 o'clock. We will instantly call all outstanding massive debts due in full, and we will initiate hostile liquidation proceedings by this afternoon." Absolute panic erupted around the table. The younger executives, who had blindly followed Grant's data-driven revolution, suddenly realized they were standing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, and the captain had just bolted the lifeboats to the floor. Elias Mercer, sitting quietly near the center of the table, slowly raised his frail, trembling hand. The room instantly fell dead silent. The old man looked at the grandson he had foolishly trusted, his eyes filled with a mixture of deep sorrow and hardened resolve. "I cast the first official board vote," Elias said, his voice raspy but entirely steady. "I vote for the immediate, unconditional termination of Grant Mercer from the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective this exact second. Furthermore, his corporate shares are to be placed into a blind trust to mitigate our immediate legal liability." It was a total bloodbath. Driven by sheer financial terror and the desperate need for self-preservation, every single remaining member of the board quickly raised their hands. It was entirely unanimous. Grant opened his mouth to scream, to threaten, to demand loyalty, but no words came out. He was completely suffocated by the reality of his own breathtaking arrogance. 2 heavily built corporate security guards stepped into the boardroom. They did not ask Grant to leave. They firmly grasped him by the elbows and physically escorted him away from the table. As he was marched out of the room, he was forced to walk down the exact same polished, glass-lined hallway where he had proudly filmed his little propaganda video. He walked past the very spot where he had arrogantly branded me the gravel woman, believing it was a brilliant display of his modern leadership. Now, that exact phrase hung over him as the ultimate, inescapable label of his monumental stupidity. Once the heavy doors clicked shut behind him, the panicked board members immediately turned their desperate, pleading eyes back to me. They offered me the entire kingdom. They begged me to take the empty chair at the head of the table, to merge my land back into their corporate fold, and to save their legacy. "I am not accepting your offer," I told them calmly, packing my documents back into the leather portfolio. "I do not want to run Blackridge. Blackridge is a dying brand buried in debt and damaged beyond repair in the commercial market. However, since you are now entirely desperate for liquid cash to satisfy your furious lenders, I am prepared to purchase your heavy crushing machinery, your fleet of tandem transport trucks, and your asphalt mixing plants. I will pay exactly 30 cents on the dollar for the equipment. You have until Monday to accept the buyout, or you can try to sell rusted metal to the scrapyards." I walked out of the executive tower and never looked back. Over the next 4 weeks, the industry landscape was violently and permanently rewritten. I executed the massive, heavily discounted buyout of the physical Blackridge machinery. I solidified the ironclad, highly lucrative strategic partnership with Naomi Reed and Monarch Roadworks. I took the massive tracts of land, the deep water rights, and the heavy iron, and I formally established a brand new, debt-free corporate entity, Davis Quarry and Materials. I was no longer a middle manager hiding in the background. I was the absolute, undisputed owner and operator of the largest aggregate supply chain in the region. The very first action I took was calling my people back home. Every single core operator, driver, and technician who had walked out during the crisis was immediately rehired with full benefits and a massive loyalty bonus. Mara Coleman was officially promoted to the position of Chief Operating Officer, running the daily logistics with a brilliant, fierce efficiency that no software program could ever hope to replicate. 6 months later, I stood on the jagged rim of the eastern overlook just as the sun began to crest the horizon. The morning air was sharp and cold. I looked down into the massive, sprawling limestone basin. The heavy yellow front-end loaders were already moving, their backup alarms echoing rhythmically off the sheer rock walls. Mara radioed the control tower, and a moment later, the deafening, beautiful, bone-rattling roar of the primary jaw crusher shattered the morning silence. A thick, familiar cloud of gray stone dust began to rise into the sky. I looked down at my heavy steel-toed boots, watching the fresh layer of grit settle over the worn leather. I smiled, feeling the deep, powerful vibration of the crushing plant humming through the solid earth and directly into my bones. Grant Mercer had looked at the dust on my hands and seen only weakness. He had fundamentally failed to understand the most basic rule of the heavy construction world. Some people only realize who actually controls the foundation when the ground completely drops out from underneath their expensive shoes. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support it further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.